Welcome to the Filmlings podcast,
a bi-weekly podcast where we analyze all that goes into effective filmmaking.
I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Alex.
And this is episode 101, World War II Propaganda.
Yeah, the start of two things today, Jonathan. Both the start of our World War II series, which is set to last 5 episodes, because a lot of movies have been made about World War II, if you didn't hear.
And
the start of our 4th season.
Yeah, where all of our episodes will be starting with 100, which is crazy.
That's going to be happening for 2 seasons, actually.
Yeah.
Well, actually, no. It's going to be happening for several.
Yeah, I think probably end up being about 4.
Several
but still,
seasons.
We're past the 100 episode mark, which is awesome, and I'm very excited about all the stuff that we've got coming up this year. So we're starting off with World War II. It's a bit of a heavy subject, but I think throughout the last couple seasons, we've every time we come up to a World War II movie, we're like, man, a lot of movies came out of World War II. Obviously, it's the world's biggest conflict to date. And, whether it's throughout the war or after the war or before the war, there's just so much stuff that needed to be said on various sides of the conflict that there's so many films that we figured the best way to cover it is to just put a bunch of them together in an episode, which is not exhaustive. We're still going back and forth on which ones that we can actually include in our 5 episodes. But I think the one thing that World War II gave to film, and it didn't invent this, but it was probably the first and most extensive use of propaganda. And so that's what we're looking at today, is how cinema is used to form ideas and to debate ideas made in other films. And that was done all throughout World War II, and that's what we're taking a look at today.
Yeah. I mean, film was around when World War I happened, but it was still silent. And it works much better when you can have emotional oration or emotional narration and dialogue and combined with the images in film in order to make effective propaganda in that medium. So yes, it certainly is interesting. A lot of the stuff today is very blunt. And a lot of it's probably fairly controversial. But remember, we're going to be taking a fairly objective look at this as propaganda. We're not going to be taking any sides on anything.
The sides we're going to be taking are Nazis are bad.
Yes, obviously that one. But we're not going to be commenting. The American and Japanese editions, we're probably not going to comment as much on their morality. But yes, certainly the first one today is going to be... it's interesting, Jonathan. It's the first film we've covered that I think it was directed by a Nazi.
I think that's probably true. So we are starting off with Triumph of the Will from 1935, directed by Leni Riefenstahl, the most famous filmmaker of the Third Reich. She also directed a couple of films. She directed several other films, but some of her more famous ones are the coverage of the 1936 Olympics, which was supposed to be this great triumphant kind of coverage of how great and strong Germany is, which makes watching America win a bunch of events really great.
Jesse Owens just wipes the floor.
Oh my gosh,
in
that
every
dude
competition
was
he's
insane.
in.
Yeah, so
it's weird too. They all do different sports back then too. People competed in 10 different events. Although I believe the decathlon is still a thing in the Olympics, but this was more of just a set of happenstances, and the fact that everything was track and field or swimming. Yeah.
I don't know the evolution of the Olympics by any means, but watching some of that footage, she has this very cinematic eye, and we're going to get into all of that, especially for covering live events and documentary type of footage, which is what Triumph of the Will is, because it is a coverage of this I can't remember exactly where the meeting is, but one of the biggest meetings for the National Socialist Party.
It's a meeting in Nuremberg.
In Nuremberg.
And very interesting thing to consider when thinking about the backdrop to this film. Leni Riefenstahl had actually made a very similar film previous to this one in 1933 called The Victory of the Faith, about the Nazis and a meeting they had. But following the Night of the Long Knives, which showed Hitler with Ernst Röhm, who was formerly the head of one of the paramilitary organizations within the Nazi Party, but then during the Night of Long Knives, he had brutally assassinated, along with many other political rivals within the party. They wanted to remake a very similar film that did not have him being friendly with his denounced and deceased political rivals.
Yeah, which is all part of what propaganda is. And as we're going to see, this film is almost the film that kind of kicks off propaganda as a tool for building morale and building a way of thinking that will bleed over into some of the other films, including the Why We Fight series, which is the second film we're going to be talking about today. We're going to mostly be covering the first one, but kind of the whole series. The first film is called Prelude to War from 1942, directed by Frank Capra, and is the first of what ended up being 7 films that Frank Capra made throughout the war. One of the biggest filmmaking achievements during the war, and as we'll see, Frank Capra almost exclusively used footage from the war and from even the Nazis and the other sides in the war to show their own ideas and to explain why America should get involved.
Yes, and it is a long series of films that I just finished last night, Jonathan.
I'm almost done. I think I have like the last 2 left, but yeah, they're fascinating.
They're extensive. They are. It's an interesting like switch between propaganda and then just like recounting like the steps of the war as they happen, because most of them come out before 1945. Yeah, but all like very like through a lens of like what the available knowledge was at the time, or like, you know, it's so interesting because 1945 when the Battle of Russia comes out, which is one of the films in the series, the Russians and the Soviets are like our best friends, and we're talking them up like crazy.
Yeah, I know.
And China's our best friend, and we're talking them up like crazy. And then like the next year, we're into the Red Scare,
right?
Which is the Cold War is a totally different discussion. But
yeah,
it's just interesting to see all the different lenses that it's being that's you're looking through. And then finally today we have a very interesting film that I did not realize what you had put on the list, Jonathan, until I got to it. But then I was very excited because it's been on my list forever. It's been on my list because it's supposedly the first feature-length anime film ever. It's Momotaro, Sacred Soldiers. You'll probably find it under the name Momotaro's Divine Sea Warriors. From 1945, directed by Mitsuyo Seo. And it is fascinating. It is also, it's just really weird because it's like kid friendly, but at the same time it's like, let's conquer the world, and like it's interesting on a lot of levels.
Not to mention Japan's trying to figure out like their animation style, and so it gets into some strange realms at points. It's
both like early Disney, but also all of the elements that become signature Japanese anime are already there. And like I kept seeing shots and being like, that would be in a Miyazaki film. That would be in a Miyazaki film. That would be in a Disney short. Yeah, right. Like that would be in a Disney short. Yes, it's very strange. And we will talk about the weirdness of the animated faces as well. All right, Jonathan, without further ado, let's jump into the first one, Triumph of the Will from 1935. Jason, take it away for us.
Triumph of the Will from 1935. Following the party purge during the Night of the Long Knives, the German National Socialist, or Nazi Party, holds a party conference in Nuremberg in 1934. This film was made at the order of the party by Helene Leni Riefenstahl and comprises entirely of documentary footage of the conference and the people of Nuremberg. It also contains many speeches from the party leadership.
All right, Jonathan. So let's take a look at the propagandic angle of this movie before we discuss the rest of it, which is interesting and it is beautiful in a way because of the way it's shot. But it's essentially aimed both internally, both to suppress the former image of the Nazi Party. Remember, there were all those people who were killed during the Night of the Long Knife. So in a way, they're like presenting, this is the new Nazi Party. These are the people who you should be paying attention to. And I believe more or less these are still the same set of assholes who end up being the leaders during World War II.
Oh yeah, I mean you see Goebbels and all the big names that become the big names in the Nuremberg trial are the ones that you're like, oh yeah, they all killed themselves because they realized that their giant plan had just crumbled around their ears.
Yeah, Cyanide Pill Club.
New John Hughes film.
Oh, probably. Yes, so both aimed internally at suppressing the old image of the Nazi Party, but also aimed at this is meant to be like a prideful, and it is, and stirring film for anybody who is German. It's meant to be, it's chock full of imagery of German history and German pride, and it shows different cultural German activities and shows all these different aspects of the German culture. And then there's all these guys just spouting about how Germany is amazing. And of course, then by the time you enter the third act, there's a bunch of shouting about, it's all shouting. Good gosh.
Because it's all in German. So.
It's so angry, which is a surprising contrast to how it is filmed.
It's filmed gracefully.
Yeah, it's filmed gracefully and some slow-mo and these large shots with a bunch of extras. But then by the end, they're shouting all this rhetoric about how they make you all prideful in Germany, and then they connect Germany to Hitler and put the two together. And they're like, Hitler is Germany, Germany is Hitler. If you're prideful as being German, you're prideful of Hitler. Therefore, you will listen to Hitler and the Nazi Party. And also, even though it's kind of shown off as more of an impressive thing or a beautiful thing or a prideful thing, they also show thousands and thousands of soldiers and guns marching and being trained and all that stuff.
In perfect unison.
Yeah, which is both intimidating if you're not German or if you're a German dissident. It's kind of aimed at repressing that. But at the same time, it also gives the feeling by the end of the movie, if you're expecting more conflict to come, both within and without Germany, of this feeling of invincibility almost. Because you see all these... And, in 1936, it's been a while since the last World War, almost 2 decades. You don't... you're probably not registering the horror of war. You're probably just registering, if war comes, we're fine. Which is crazy.
Yeah, and it's also interesting because, Germany was not supposed to build a giant army after World War I, according to the Geneva Convention. And also,
I think... the Geneva Convention or was it a Treaty of Versailles?
Yeah, whichever one. I'm trying to get the history of World War II down. I'm not solid on the rest of my history.
No harm nor foul. There's 50 different treaties of Versailles.
Yeah.
So that's okay.
But yeah, according to the contract at the end of World War I, they were not supposed to build a giant army.
They're definitely not.
And so that's the other thing that I keep thinking about when watching Triumph of the Will is, if you're a German citizen, you've been beat in World War I, you've been asked to pay for it all, and you've gone economic
through 2 decades
insecurity,
of economic collapse.
Yeah, economic insecurity.
Not just the recession, collapse. Like the Great Depression times 2 decades.
Yeah, those photos of the German kids just playing with piles of money. That's absolutely worthless.
Yeah.
So yeah, you're feeling we lost one world war. If something else happens, we're not allowed to have a big enough army to protect ourselves. We don't have any money, yada, yada, yada. So like, you're not feeling great about your country. And then this film comes along and it says, Germany is amazing. Germany has been amazing. Germany always will be amazing. And this is the guy who's going to...
They're definitely selling Hitler as a savior.
Yeah, exactly. And Germany as a great country still, like you were saying. The one thing that I think is really interesting about this film, especially in contrast to some of the other propaganda films that eventually start coming about once the war starts, is the fact that it's not directly selling anything. It is documenting this convention. It is showing Hitler arriving. Everybody loves him. He's well protected. He has these great, soldiers who are all perfectly trained. And then he gets to the thing. And like, as you go through, Riefenstahl puts in shots of, oh, we're going down this canal. Look how great our city is. Look how great all these things are.
Everything's looked up at in the beginning. Yeah. Like all of the opening montage is essentially Hitler driving through the city, looking up at all of this German architecture. And all of the German architecture looks powerful. And Hitler's filmed at an up angle too, so he looks powerful. And
then you get these great wide shots of how huge the army is. And then you get shots of Hitler Youth.
There's so many soldiers. It's ridiculous.
Yeah. And then you see the kids. And the kids are growing up to become strapping young soldiers. And they're having a great time. They're having fun. They're playing and laughing. I love one of my favorite... so first of all, documentary and propaganda film is basically... completely dependent on the Kuleshov effect, which we talked about, we talk about several times throughout this, but basically the idea of juxtaposing two different shots in order to convey an idea. And so one of the greatest things is in the Hitler Youth bit when we're watching all of the kids get their slop from these giant vats, and this one guy drinks it, and then we cut to some other people getting their slop, and then he turns to the camera and smiles like, oh, wasn't that some great slop? And you're just like, okay, it can't be that good, really, because it's just being like mass produced for seriously so many of these kids going through this training. Like, you see all their tents set up, and then you see them playing, but it's just like, it's a massive operation. And then you get to, the giant Hitler up on this giant podium, and all the Hitler Youth is just like this huge, it literally, and I think this is intentional, it literally looks like Sauron looking out over his Uruk-hai army in Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings films. Like,
I mean, I wouldn't be shocked if they took this.
I think, it's got to be,
and other similar videos, right? Like the big military parade with the dictator overlooking is not an unfamiliar sight from this period.
Even Star Wars with the stormtroopers.
Oh yeah, there's big Star Wars vibes in here. In fact, like I think like the opening 3 notes, I thought they were about to play the Imperial Death March at the start of this movie.
Yes, John Williams definitely took inspiration from the music in this film, and it's genius, absolutely genius.
Yeah, no, it's definitely got a lot of influence, and maybe not directly to this film, but maybe like the entire imagery of who the Nazis were as an evil empire.
They gave us so much of their own, work, and even
well, yeah, they definitely wanted art, it out there.
They've given us so much like effective stuff that it's easy to kind of take that and use it the other way, which is what we're going to see in the next film.
Yeah. And make no mistake, they were selling. Like, they were selling an idea, both to, like, their own people and to the world, that they were essentially the best people. And they're trying to get everybody on board with that. And, you do that both through propaganda and then through war. Which proved out to be ineffective, which is good. But yeah, I also find it fascinating that this is essentially a documentary before the idea of a documentary was fully formed.
Yeah, it was still really raw, at least.
And of course, if you look at the earliest snippets of films, like from 1890 or something like that, they're all essentially documentary films because they're non-narrative. They're just observations of the world. And in a sense, this is also an observation of the world, but at least it's put together in a longer format on a theme. It doesn't really have a story to it, or it has a message, but not in the same way that you think of modern cinematography, modern documentary kind of playing out. And essentially, like, for this, if you look at how this movie is made, with all the impressive cinematography, on the scale it was made, and thinking of the equipment that was available, the big heavy cameras of 1935, this is only made essentially because of the Nazi regime, because it had all this power.
And resources.
It's ridiculous, and kind of absurd that this is put together. Yeah,
and that's the other thing, is like, Leni Riefenstahl is not some indie guerrilla filmmaker just out there kind of covering this event. She is commissioned by the National Socialist Party to put this together. So she knows exactly where they're going to be. She knows where to put the cameras. She has access to any position that she wants. I think there's a shot, again, in that big Hitler Youth gathering scene where they're listening to Hitler, and you see like the huge swastikas in the background, and there are these pillars that are holding them up, and you can see this tiny little elevator looking thing going up one of them, which had a camera on it, which then you cut to this giant wide shot, and that's where that angle is coming from. Like, they planned all of this out ahead of time. None of it is like improvised. And the other thing that I think works really well on a cinematic level is, photography is based on ideas of pattern and shape and repetition and all these kind of things. That is exactly what the stormtroopers were built on as well. They were, you have all of these shots of the stormtroopers goose stepping in formation, in line, filling the frame, perfectly spaced out. Every shot looks like it was staged, because it kind of was, not necessarily for the camera, halfway for the camera, but just because it just lends itself to being filmed really, really well. And so all of these things go into creating this really subliminal emotional response in the audience.
Yeah, no, it has it's kind of a masterclass in like emotional manipulation. Especially because it essentially, and I think through lack of knowledge or innovation across the film world at the time, if this had gone, if this had been made a few years later, like we'll see with the next film we're about to talk about, there would definitely be narration over it. And almost the fact that there is no narration in this film makes the message more subtle at the beginning. It kind of just puts you into the scene in a weird way.
It almost assumes the message, and then you have to catch up to it.
Yeah. It definitely is. It makes you work for it, which actually makes you more engrossed.
Yeah, more connected to the message.
Yeah, which is weird. And again, remember, as effective as this is, it's literally Nazis.
Right. Which is why when American filmmakers, like specifically Frank Capra, saw this, they started quaking in their boots, basically, because they were like, this enemy knows what they're doing. And it terrified Frank Capra so much, to the point where he had already been commissioned to create all of these films, and by the time he saw this, he was like, how am I going to make anything as effective as this when I don't have any footage? Nobody's working with me. There's this system that's working against me. And so he was like, how about I just use this and turn it against them? And so that's what happened in our next movie. Yes.
So on to our next movie, Jonathan. Why We Fight, Prelude to War, 1942, which we're kind of going to use as a focus and discuss that film specifically, but also at the same time we're kind of discussing the whole series. So, Jason, why don't you take it away?
Why We Fight, Prelude to War, from 1942. The first in a 7-part propaganda/documentary series by Frank Capra, Prelude to War discusses the stakes of the current world conflict, World War II, by examining the two worlds at war with each other. The free world, led by America, and the slave world, dominated by Germany, Italy, and Japan. By looking closely at life within the slave world and the actions of its leaders, Why We Fight aims to convince those of the free world, especially American isolationists, that they have to stand up and fight.
Honestly, this series is kind of the best thing to watch before a 5-episode long deep dive into World War II, because it gives you the full context of almost every battle, every back and forth of the Nazi invasions, and all of that. Like this, it's so thorough that, you know, as we go into these films that zero in on minute moments, this is a really good thing to just have a overview of the entirety of World War II as it was happening.
Yes. No, this is kind of like on the style, Jonathan, of a newsreel.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I wanted to bring up because like we were talking about, documentaries as a film form were not fully developed. But basically, I think what did exist of documentaries was news coverage. And something that I had forgotten until I watched the Netflix documentary 5 Came Back, which I think is going to be a great supplement to this series for anyone who's interested in these films that we're talking about, is that newsreels were shown before movies. Because that's before television was a thing. You went to the movies, you saw the news, then you saw an animated short, and then you saw your movie. And so a lot of the way that people got their news was by going to the movies, and then obviously your newspaper. But newspaper doesn't have the type of film images that actually make things feel real. And so Frank Capra is then charged with creating a series of 7 films, or I don't even know if it was set at 7 from the beginning, but that are basically like feature-length newsreels. And he's like, I don't know how to make a documentary. I don't know how to do this. And then again, he sees Triumph of the Will, and he's like, all right, well, let's just take this and just explain why this is really, really bad. And so Frank Capra's job throughout World War II, I think, is fascinating because he basically starts off still in Hollywood. He gets his own little section of Hollywood, and he's just sitting there in an edit room taking newsreels, taking stuff from the Nazis like Triumph of the Will, chopping it up, putting narration over it, done by Walter Huston, by the way, who we saw in Treasure of the Sierra Madre. And that's what they're described as, is a series of informational films. That's exactly what they are. They are propaganda because it's supposed to help the Americans understand at the beginning why the war needs to be fought. And then later on, it gets more into what is actually going on the different fronts of the war. But it's also just like, a lot of it is straight facts, which is one of the ways that he gets you into, just believing all of it. Because there are some times when, he stretches things, but for a large portion of it, it's just straight facts.
Yeah, it's all presented. The facts are presented in a certain order, with a certain tone, and with a certain perspective that makes it propaganda. But it is more or less just recounting events and situations and facts. Of course, this one is I thought this one was really interesting. The first one, the deeper you go, the less propagandic they get, until the last one, which is essentially an argument against American isolationism, which, if you're not familiar with that is essentially the prevailing international world philosophy of Americans for most of the 19th and about half of the 20th century, in which America was like, let's not get involved with anything that isn't here in America. And as you can see, in the last half of the 20th century, that dramatically changed. But essentially that led to America not being involved with the first couple of years of World War II and the first 3 years of World War I.
Yeah.
Until something happened that forced the hand of America into joining both the sinking of that cruise ship, the Lusitania, in World War I, and the Battle of Pearl Harbor in World War II. Although it could have been argued in both instances that there were large portions of America, both at the civilian level and the governmental level, who were ready and willing to go to war and were just waiting for an excuse to do so. Pearl Harbor, less of an excuse, more of a, well, we've got to do this now.
Right.
And the Lusitania was more of a, this is a good casus belli. Let's do this. But yeah, this is essentially the first few minutes of this documentary are essentially just asking. It's literally man on the street type footage of just asking people whether or not we were going to get involved in the conflict or whether or not we should. And then the rest of the thing is showing why this conflict is such a big deal.
That is the most annoyingly cherry-picked section of this whole thing to me. And I feel like I think what that section was from American isolationists. They had created a piece that, was for isolationism. And then Frank Capra was like, here's what people want you to think, that we don't want anything to do with these foreign affairs. And here's why we do need to have something to do with them. And then he goes into, he gets into all the politics of the thing, as well as, the history of, how, why Germany is taking these invasive actions, and all of that kind of stuff. It really covers it from pretty much every angle. And one of the other fascinating things about this to me is the use of motion graphics, and which what we would today call motion graphics, but was literally just animation then. And I believe all the animation for these was done by Disney. Yeah.
Yeah. It said in the films, they say it's provided by the War Department, but that was on Disney's contract with the War Department, because Disney did a lot of stuff with the War Department.
That literally just means we made someone a major or a colonel or something, and so now we can say War Department.
Yeah. It's really well done. And in fact, they used the Disney animation to kind of show you a worst case scenario of what happens if, the Nazis win or the Axis wins in Eurasia. And it's literally the scenario for the man in the high castle.
Yeah. Well, what it is the plan that is explicitly laid out in Mein Kampf and the other National Socialist documents. That's what the narration says. This is what their plan is. If they succeed, they're gonna, go through Great Britain, and then they're gonna get to America, and then Japan's gonna come from the other side. And so, based on the documentation that they had, that is what they were expecting Germany and Japan to do. And yeah, it makes it look really bleak, and that's the point.
Yeah, and they do. He makes a conscious choice to list out only two scenarios. The one in which the liberal democratic world wins, and the one in which the National Socialists win. Nothing else, no in between. He makes it very black and white because he's trying to push it towards the audience towards decisive action. And if you're going to push somebody towards making a decision, you don't want to give them three options or four options or five options. You want to give them two.
Well, yeah, on that point, one of the most striking, rhetorical devices that he uses in this film is the free world and the slave world. And he literally breaks this down. He shows a globe that is light and a globe that is much darker. And he says, democracy is this light, good world, and Hitler's world is this dark slave world. And then he goes back and forth, and he shows in the free world, we have all these things. We can think whatever we want. We can say whatever we want. In the slave world, Hitler won't let you think anything aside from what he wants you to, and he'll kill all of his political opponents and stuff like that. And that takes a big chunk of this film, and it's one of the most unique elements of Prelude to War as opposed to the other ones. And it's, again, and I think that one interesting thing about these propaganda films is that it's almost straight rhetorical theory, like you learn in high school. It's using ethos, pathos, and logos to build an argument. And Frank Capra doesn't do it subtly like Leni Riefenstahl, where she's just like documenting this event that's happening. Frank Capra's like, here, you know what? We've got to get into this war. Here's why. And then he just goes through all the reasons that he can fit into an hour to build his argument.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, it moves fast. This was maybe one of the most difficult films I've ever had to take notes on, just because it moves so fast.
Yeah, there's so much packed into it.
Yeah, and it moves quickly. And that's good because, one, there's a lot of cover, and two, there's just this overall sense of urgency to the film, which works. And it's actually impressive considering how wide of a variety of sources he had to pull this. He had to pull all this footage from. It comes from both narrative films from around the world and newsreel footage and, enemy footage that was captured, as is listed out, I think, specifically in the start of some of these films, other propagandic films, all sorts of stuff, which is just fascinating to pull from that wide of an array of material and put it together in that long of a format. That's kind of a new thing at the start of World War II. And it is kind of like another form of documentary. It quickly becomes another form of documentary. And I think this one could definitely be called documentary. Triumph of the Will, I think you'd have to call proto-documentary. And this is a different style.
I think it's a fly on the wall documentary, but I think Triumph of the Will definitely still falls in documentary category.
True. But in the more less structured sense.
Yeah.
But yes, this one, I think this is almost like a prelude to me to the modern idea of a Ken Burns documentary, which is a bunch of footage and pictures and animated maps with somebody talking over it, telling you facts. And they're obviously skewing those facts to a certain viewpoint or certain understanding of history or current events. But they're essentially just staying close to the facts.
Yeah, and I was going to say that the only thing that this is missing is interview footage, and it is in the sense of talking head aside from those men on the street style interviews. But I think in this film they have one of the war generals come on and he explains part of it. They're like, and here's General so-and-so to explain what the tactic was for this and this. That might have been one of the other ones, but he's using all of these different sources of credibility between facts and, like you're saying, historical footage and current news footage. I thought it was really interesting that in the Battle of Russia, which is the longest and, a lot of people consider Prelude to War and the Battle of Russia, which I think is the fifth one, as the most impactful of the 7 films. But in Battle of Russia, he literally pulls old Russian narrative film footage from Alexander Nevsky to explain the history of Russia being invaded by Germany multiple times and all that kind of thing. So like I said, again, if you go back and watch Five Came Back, which is about 5 of the classic Hollywood directors that went to World War II and the films that they made during that time and how it changed their filmmaking after the time, Frank Capra's job is really interesting because he makes these 7 huge, exhaustive films, but he's kind of doing it all from the cutting room in America. And so he's taking as much found footage, literally anything he can get his hands on. And eventually, towards the end of the series, he starts doing some recreations because people are reacting to these, and so he's trying to make them better and better. But at the beginning, he literally will just grab anything he can get his hands on and build a story out of it, which is what a lot of modern filmmakers do, depending on their subject. Like if you're making a film about something that is over, that's all you really have to work with, that in interviews. And that's what Frank Capra was doing, just trying to pump these out as fast as he possibly could. All right, so with all that, let's get into the most unique of the three. One of the most unique films I've ever seen, Momotaro. Jason, set that one up for us.
Momotaro's Divine Sea Warriors from 1945. Considered the first full-length anime film from Japan, Momotaro's Sacred Soldiers, or Momotaro's Divine Sea Warriors, tells the story of 4 friends: monkey, bear, puppy, and pheasant. The group have just graduated from Japanese naval training and set off on the Pacific War. On the way, they help to civilize the uncultured island natives and then launch a mission to capture the British-held island of Celebes. Finally, they set their sights on America and control of the entire Pacific, all the while pushing themes of national pride, teamwork, and disregard for one's personal safety in the pursuit of duty.
It's almost a shame, Jonathan, that we don't have Jason on the show today to talk about this one, because this feels very
as our
much
resident anime expert,
like a Jason movie.
Not that Jason wants to train children to go to war or anything.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting because it is very much an anime. Obviously, the first feature length use of it as a narrative, and I believe there are other Momotaro movies, or at least clips of some kind.
Because I think Momotaro is the name of like a mythology figure in Japanese mythology, but I'm not positive about that.
Well, let me find out. Yes,
translates to Peach Taro, Peach Boy.
So Momotaro, which as Jonathan has just pointed out, translates to Peach Taro. Taro
or
being
Peach
Boy, a Peach Boy being
the
a common
Marvel
masculine
superhero.
name in a very common Japanese masculine name for new baby boys. Was a local hero in a lot of Japanese folklore and was obviously incorporated into this movie, which is also jam-packed full of national pride in a way.
I
mean, it has very clear set values: teamwork, heroism, putting the good of the group above your own personal safety, such as when Puppy jumps into the river without a second thought to save Momotaro's. Or I believe Momotaro might be the captain, not the.
Yeah, Momotaro's the human one out of all of these animals, which is interesting.
Very little time on screen. But yes, so this is very much a kind of a kid's story, and it's made very clear why at the end. It essentially shows all of the positive things that the Japanese are doing by expanding out into the Pacific and conquering islands, such as bringing culture and knowledge to the ignorant primitives of various islands, which was very blatant.
Which is ironic, given the story of the white conquerors in the middle of the movie.
Yes, yeah, no, it does turn on a heel, and say that it's liberating this island by conquering it back from the white people who
conquered it in the first place.
In a very devious way, as compared to the honorable way in which the Japanese army conquers it. And then, of course, at the very end, you can tell, if you weren't sure it was aimed at kids by all of the fun, cuddly animals committing total warfare.
Yeah.
Then at the very end, it shows the next generation of kids preparing to invade literally America as they take turns jumping off of a ladder onto a chalk outline on the ground of North America.
The last shot is the cute little monkey that we've been rooting for from the beginning because the monkey keeps getting lost or drowning or whatever. And he jumps off the tree onto the outline of America, stomps on it, and then runs away. And that's the end of the movie. But along the way, this film has the most convoluted structure of almost anything I've ever seen. It goes from these sailors coming back, well, quote unquote sailors, because we find out that they're naval pilots. And then, Big Brother is talking about what it takes to be a pilot. And then at some point they're in class and they start singing this alphabet song that goes on for so long.
It's a long alphabet song. At first I was like, well, this makes sense. The Japanese alphabet's a little long. But then I realized they were repeating it.
They repeated it 3 times.
It just goes on and on and on. But yes, so it's curious because sequences like that felt very Disney, right? A lot of the character animation feels very Disney in the way they move. And I'm talking earlier Disney, like Steamboat Willie type stuff.
Yeah. Like those, the 3 monkeys, the one with the big nose and the other ones, and they're singing about bananas or something.
What was almost certainly it felt like a racist slam against other Pacific Islanders.
I don't even know.
They're uncultured. They're uncouth. They need us to come in and teach them what's right. Apparently.
That's right, because they're wearing the those hats. I can't remember what the.
I know what you're talking about. They're essentially dressed as island natives who the Japanese need to come in and save from themselves.
Teach them the difference between a banana and a parachute.
Yeah, no, it's heavy-handed and it's insulting. And it's full aimed of
at children,
pride.
Straight at children, this is the only one of the ones that we're looking at. In our bonus podcast next week, we'll be talking about some Disney propaganda, but this one is just I feel like most of this goes straight over kids' heads, but the idea is a subconscious one. It's the idea of national pride and training to be one of these quote unquote sacred soldiers is a good thing. And, invasion is a good thing, all this kind of stuff that the idea generally gets across, but the finer details of which I don't think children will totally understand if they can follow the story structure of this movie at all, which I was struggling to.
Yeah, it's a bit all over the place. They're trying to figure out how to put together an hour and a half of animation to make it cohesive.
Yeah.
Which is not entirely inaccurate. And one of the things I find most fascinating in this movie is the clash between Western, essentially Disney. There are a few other players in the game. But if we're talking about Western animation, we're talking about Disney. Disney-style animation and would eventually become essential Japanese anime technique. And part of it is, the Disney-esque characters, the friendly, cuddly animals, the way they're drawn with a little extra bounce in their movement. Very Steamboat Willie-ish, very exaggerated.
Some wiggle in their limbs, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, a lot of wiggling, which is still occasionally used in modern anime TV shows, but it's used for comedic moments when characters suddenly change style and become exaggerated, like chibi versions of themselves. And then there's all of these Japanese things in here. And one of the things that you just mentioned, Jonathan, that we know Miyazaki does is he kind of starts out with the concept and then kind of ad-libs the plot as he goes. And a lot of inspiration is taken from what we can draw at a certain moment and what is fueled creatively by what we're drawing, and then you take it in that direction as you move forward. And this kind of feels the same way. It also has a lot of that dreamlike quality of modern anime where we kind of get lost sometimes in the aesthetic moments of something, watching leaves float or watching birds fly or watching rivers flow. I swear to God, the river flows in this movie are spot on. Like, there's cutaways of just rivers flowing and bubbling, and they're spot on what Miyazaki does in his movies. where you just like have a close up on water flowing somewhere through a field, and it's just this really nice moment that is both aesthetically and tonally resonant with what's going on in the movie at the time.
Yeah, I think it might actually be interesting to kind of watch this film and then The Wind Rises back to back, because
which is
The
set
Wind
during
Rises,
World War II.
Yeah, which is set during World War II. It's a look back on a guy who does not want to be involved. And so it kind of would track the thought process of the Japanese regarding World War II after the fact, and also the evolution of animated children's entertainment in Japan. So I don't know. But yeah, a lot of the animation is really beautiful. Some of the character animation gets a little unnerving.
Oh gosh, they hadn't figured out what to do with the lips and the close-up.
Yeah, half the time the monkey doesn't have lips, and then when they zoom into his face, he does have lips, and it is one of the most unsettling things. But there's actually a moment. I'm just kind of clicking around here on YouTube. I'll post a link to probably all three of these films in the blog post today, because they're all available online. But there's actually this really interesting moment that I'd almost forgotten, where the brother has come back. He's kind of explained his service, what he's doing to all the younger kids who are looking up to him. And then he goes and like blows a dandelion and almost has this PTSD moment of seeing.
Yeah. It's like Apocalypse Now.
Yeah.
Where he's staring up the fan blade, but he's seeing these dandelions fall, and instead he's like picturing the paratroopers fall, which I think was done just for like the sake of animation and thematic intent, and this is an interesting.
But it almost negates itself.
It almost does. Yeah, it definitely felt like a moment of an artist working on the movie wanting to be artistic. And maybe somebody wanted to go farther with it. Maybe they didn't. But they definitely couldn't go any farther with it, because going any farther with it would have undercut the entire movie. By saying like, hey, being a soldier isn't good. And that's the opposite of what they wanted to tell their audience, which is young Japanese children, that being a soldier is good. This is fun and great, and you're doing the good thing, and you're out there liberating and educating and bring culture to the uncultured. All sorts of stuff like that.
It is definitely an interesting watch, but it's so fascinating to look at all three of these kind of in context together. Did you have anything else specifically about Momotaro, or can we move on into overall stuff?
Not really.
Okay, I mean, I just think that, these three different approaches to propaganda from three different points in the war. Triumph of the Will is 1935, so this is before war actually starts. Why We Fight is comes out just before Pearl Harbor, and then Momotaro is 1945, so it's actually pretty late in the war. And they all have slightly different target audiences. Triumph of the Will is aimed at obviously the Germans, getting them on board. Why We Fight is aimed at the Americans, and then Momotaro is aimed at Japanese children. And their approaches from just kind of this stoic observation to a nuanced argument building to a subliminal fun kind of entertainment. It's just, propaganda is such a big part of this war, and the ways that it's used is so diverse, even beyond the things that we've covered here, because there were other filmmakers, making films of each battle, because there were cameramen everywhere. There were cameramen at D-Day. There were cameramen at, outposts where no war actually happened. And wherever there were filmmakers, be it Hollywood filmmakers, British filmmakers, these were being cut and turned into propaganda pieces that would either show what war is like, show why we need to be in the war, show why the other side is bad, et cetera, et cetera. These are all arguments being built through the medium of film.
Yeah, and this is probably the first major war where that was at the disposal of those involved on a wide scale. And not just one side had it, but everybody had it. And everybody used it widely and then disseminated that propaganda widely. Yeah. It's also unique in that the Nazis were they pretty much were a problem 10 years before the war started. And they've been making noise, making waves, and putting out propaganda for 10 years.
Yeah, they were telling the world.
They had a decade of propaganda out there before the war even started, which makes an even more interesting study in that case. Also, it's one of the most ideologically fueled wars ever.
That's true.
Very much about like the way, like people having different ideas about how humans should live. How
government should operate. This is
a better way for us to live than that. That's a better way for us to live than that. I disagree with your worldview. You disagree with mine. Whereas even going back to World War I, it had nationalistic ideas in the sense that, my nation is the best. I'm proud to be one of them. We should conquer things because that's what nation states do. But it wasn't necessarily combat fascism versus communism versus liberal democracy,
right?
In any sense. So it kind of marks a shift in both war history, world history, propaganda history, and then almost every armed conflict since then has had a very large propaganda influence. How it's perceived both on the home front, both in the international community, all sorts of different angles to look at it, and different people taking advantage of the media of film and then eventually, video, which for this purpose is the same thing. It's sound,
right.
It's sound and image married together to influence how other people think and who they support.
Yeah, and I think that this idea, because, propaganda is not limited to the film medium. There were, posters, there were photographs, there were news stories. All of that falls under the category of propaganda. But I think that the most interesting thing about film being used is that it can show the actual events that are happening, and it can be rearranged in such a way that the same footage can be used to create two different arguments, like Triumph of the Will, which was used to bolster the German morale in the first case, and then used to, demonstrate a threat and kind of do the exact opposite of what it was intended to do. And so the medium of film being used for propaganda kind of comes about during this war, and I think it becomes one of the most effective forms of propaganda, so much so that I think nowadays we're so wary of the term or the label of propaganda that anything that actually does want to be used as propaganda has to do it way more subtly.
It has to slip your guard in a way.
Yeah, because nowadays, anytime someone thinks that they're watching something that is trying to change their mind or argue anything, suddenly guards go up and the whole thing becomes invalid. And so I do think that obviously the causes that were being espoused in World War II are much more drastic than anything that we're facing right now. But the approach to propaganda has changed drastically since then. It was used incredibly effectively and incredibly straightforwardly in World War II, and it was used so effectively that it can't be used that blatantly anymore because it's become so almost inextricably linked to this type of filmmaking.
Yeah. No, I mean, the as the public becomes more resistant to the idea of having their minds change, it's almost like how a virus has to keep evolving in order to stay alive and keep propagating.
Not the most sympathetic example, but I get what you're saying.
Not the most sympathetic example, but it keeps evolving and mutating and changing in order to stay ahead of the curve. It's interesting to go back and look at one of the roots of it.
Because propaganda serves a purpose. I think, it serves a purpose which can be good or bad. So many times propaganda has a negative connotation, and that's why people turn off to it. But I think propaganda films like Why We Fight were incredibly necessary to getting America involved. And not only getting people involved, but once they're involved, you have to tell them what's actually going on. And you have to get a lot of really complicated and frankly boring and unreal information, and it has to become real. And you have to suddenly understand what you've just gotten into once you are into it. Regardless of building that argument, it's, showing the magnitude of the decision that's been made. And one of the interesting things that comes up in Five Came Back a lot is, how I guess, I don't want to say how truthful you can be about the situation of war, but there's this constant fight between showing how brutal it is to prepare those going into it and not showing how brutal it is so that people are not dissuaded from it. And both elements of showing, the brutality and the terribleness of war are important. And there's not really a clear answer because everyone's going to react to it differently. It's either, and maybe both. You can be turned off by the idea of war and prepared for it with the same clip. And so there's so many facets to this whole idea. And once people were making propaganda and knew that they were making propaganda, like Frank Capra, making those decisions of what to show and what not to show are really important.
Yeah. And it's an imperfect art form in a certain way. And it's also, I think you also have to make them with the idea that there is no objective way to communicate this information without skewing it in some way, shape, or form. Like everybody, you'd have to skew it. You can relay the same set of facts without, the order in which you say them, the tone in which you say them, the time at which you deliver that information to another person, the format in which you deliver it to another person, all impact
the amount of editorializing that you put on it.
all impact it. And it's impossible to take all of those away. You're always going to have some kind of spin put on information that's being delivered to an audience. And it's not that different from the way we manipulate audiences' sympathies in narrative filmmaking. In fact, it's pretty much the same thing. It just so happens that it happens to exist within our world and not just the world of the characters.
Yeah, which is another thing that a lot of the filmmakers that went into World War II, and again, a lot of this is coming from Five Came Back, so I highly recommend watching that film if you're interested in especially the Frank Capra propaganda stuff and several of the other filmmakers who were at these battles and documenting them. One of the other things that these Hollywood filmmakers were fighting was showing war as it is and not as Hollywood thought it was before it got involved. There's a certain veneer that goes over Hollywood films, and once these directors who had been making films about war, started to see war, first of all, they realized how untruthful they had been, how soft on war they had been, even in films that almost didn't get made because they thought they were too harsh about war. And then they struggled to make people believe that it wasn't Hollywood, that it was actually real things happening. And after the war, several directors, like George Stevens, stopped making films for a long time because they couldn't wrap their minds around how fake, all the Hollywood filmmaking and stuff was, and struggled to put the gravity and immensity of what they had seen and experienced during the war onto film. And so we're going to, throughout this series, we're going to be looking at a lot of narrative film, either film that was made while the war was happening, or films that were made after the war from people who, were there or, did a lot of research. And it's going to be really interesting to see the ways that film approaches war after this, insanely huge and traumatic event has shaken the entire world.
Yeah, no, it is. It's not just a significant point in world history; it's a very significant point in film history. And obviously, we've talked about it before. This is kind of the thing that kicks off those series of movements in the later half, in the mid to later half of the 20th century, that bring us to the form of cinema that we have today, which is very stylistic, very based on the auteur who's making it, and all of that. And
film becomes more and more naturalistic. Not right after this happens, but as Hollywood gets into like much more nitty gritty filmmaking towards the 60s and 70s, I think that the way is paved a little bit with World War II, especially, filmmakers like John Huston, who was at the Battle of Midway, and all these kind of things, filmmakers who were, John Ford directed Battle of Midway. I'm always getting those two mixed up.
I was going to say, that didn't sound like a very John Huston thing. I think he camped out on like the Aleutian Islands.
Yeah, Huston is the one that was at the outpost where nothing really happened. And Ford was just like in the middle of the battle. But, even Stevens, who was at D-Day, all these filmmakers are put into the thick of things, and then they start to rethink their own craft, and they start to, wonder how they can take some of that fantasy edge off of their Hollywood movies and make them like feel impactful and feel real. And, less in the technical arena, but this definitely starts to come through in the characters that start appearing in films, and especially in war films, which were much more glamorized before the war. And then they start to become really real and developing, PTSD and stuff like that, like William Wyler's The Best Years of Our Lives. There's just such an impact on cinema after this happens. And then these filmmakers who come back and they change the way that their films are made start to influence the filmmakers that come after them. And so, like we love to talk about, it just becomes this cycle where these things start to just make their way into our modern filmmaking.
Yeah, no, it becomes really easy to chart the course of developments and shifts and styles in modern cinema from World War II onwards.
Yeah, it's a big deal.
All right, Jonathan, but we're not done talking about it, even though I think this episode is coming to a close, because we have 4 more episodes to talk about the World War II, or different aspects of World War II cinema, or films about World War II. And next time on the show, we're going to be talking about people, kind of like
biopics.
Essentially biopics. Something involved with significant people during World War II. And while there have been maybe 1 or 2 done on like the soldiers level, they tend to be somewhat fictionalized. They tend to be, more in the dramatic nature. So a lot of the people in the biographical category tend to be, leaders of some sort, or people or generals or something like that. So specifically, next time on the podcast, we're going to be talking about Patton from 1970, which is obviously all about General Patton, who was definitely a character. I've seen that movie multiple times. Then we're going to talk about The King's Speech from 2010, obviously talking about almost again, like, in a sense, propaganda, speaking so that the people feel good during World War II. And then finally, we're going to talk about The Darkest Hour from 2017, which is about Churchill, and something relatively recent about World War II.
Yeah, and again, Darkest Hour is even about oration and building arguments. So a lot of this stuff is going to carry over. So yeah, that's our episode. I will say, I will throw out, I've already brought up 5 Came Back as far as like kind of other things to watch if you're interested. And I think that's an interesting segment to bring back for this series, is like further watching if you want to. Right now, Netflix has a ton of these films on their service because 5 Came Back is a Netflix original. And so they have things like John Ford's Battle of Midway, some of Frank Capra's other films, the documentary by John Huston, Let There Be Light, about PTSD after the war that was suppressed for a long time. So there's a lot of stuff you can find on Netflix right now. And then also, if you want to see Leni Riefenstahl's filmmaking and not as much anyway of the Nazi parts of it, go ahead and watch Olympia, the 2 parts, Festival of Nations and Feast of Nations or something like that.
It's Feast of Nations and Festival of Beauty. Okay. And it is seriously some really beautiful filmmaking that's about the 1936 Olympics. And while it obviously was held in Germany and, Hitler's in the movie and there's obviously lots of Nazi flags everywhere, it's also about, all of the athletes competing and kind of like the beauty of athletics and the human body, that when it's been like fine-tuned to do one thing really well. And it's a gorgeous movie.
I was actually surprised at a lot of elements that were not blatantly like Nazi propaganda. Like she would do things like if an American won, like superimpose the American flag over them while the anthem played and not just like skip over it and that kind of stuff. So it's really, really well done all across the board. And also
you get to see Jesse Owens whoop some Nazi butt repeatedly.
Jesse Owens, yeah, he was incredible.
But yeah, that's what we have coming up next on the show. And then we have some new things to talk about as regards the Patreon, right, Jonathan?
Yeah, so we're making a couple of changes to the Patreon just because we want to make it a little bit more accessible and a little bit more maintainable for us. So we're dropping down to 2 tiers. We've had, I don't even know how many we had, 4 or 5 tiers, but we're going down to just 2, a $2 tier. And at that level, you'll have access to the polls. And also, we're going to be starting up an online community. So you can have conversations about the films or just kind of around the podcast. And then
kind of like a private chat room of sorts.
Yeah, right. And then we'll have the $5 tier, which is pretty similar to what it has been. It's going to be the bonus podcast and then also our notes and stuff from our Google Drive. And the bonus pod is going to have some changes to it as well. We're going to be adding in some discussion of short films and stuff like that because short films are a type of filmmaking that I like a lot, but are really hard to cover in especially this longer format. So we're going to be actually starting that off with our first bonus podcast of the year, which will be coming out next week. And that's going to be covering some of Disney's propaganda films, which are quite interesting to say the least.
They cover a gamut between like entertainment, propaganda, and then just like straight out like technical instruction. So it's interesting. It's a curious little segment of Disney history there. But anyway, that's all the time we have for this episode.
If you have movie suggestions for us or just want to reach out, I can be found on Twitter at JSSatchel.
And I'm at Alex Garinger.
And I'm at the Blue Jay 1994. Here's to 2020.
And to find links to things that we talked about today, you can view them on the blog at thefilmlings.com.
If you like the show, let us know. Leave us a review on iTunes so other people will know what we're all about.
We definitely appreciate it.
Talk to you next time.
All right, see ya.
In some markets, it does.
Yeah, in some markets.
1 second.
Okay.
Hello. Good. How are you? Oh, I don't think I ever picked it up, but I can come down and grab it today. Awesome, thank you. These people won't stop calling me.
Who?
Have you picked up your welcome pralines? Have you picked up your welcome coupon book?
What? At your hotel?
Yes.
They want you to get pralines?
I mean, they were good pralines, man, but, like, you don't have to call me 3 times about it.